And on that day in California, he and the late John Lewis came to my house and had lunch with my dad, talking about the election. So I'm sure we all have memories and all have thoughts. So we all know Reverend Trollinger, who is now a grandpa, and we're glad he's been really a key person in White Plains supporting the development of Grandpas United. So we're really honored to have him as our speaker and our facilitator today. And Reverend Trollinger, please. Oh, I'm sorry, Wayne. You okay? You're on mute, Wayne. You all right?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Reverend Trollinger, please.
Well, good morning to everyone. Thanks, Frank and Jim, for inviting me to participate. I have a disclosure statement to be very clear in regards to this 1968. I am 9 years old in 1968. Okay, 9 years old. So some of the other grandpas have more experience and more knowledge. I'm more of a student of history. And so the prominent thing for me in 1968, and I'll go over some stuff that I have researched, but the major thing that I remember in 1968 was two events. Coming in from the house, I lived in Mamaroneck, New York. It was an Italian and African American community. The Boy Scout, Cub Scout leaders were all white. I had no knowledge of racial prejudice, segregation, or any of the above. My father, who raised me and my brother, kept racism and prejudice and skin hatred away from me and my brother. So we really never knew up until 1968, and even a little beyond that, anything about Jim Crow or about the violence that was happening. Technically, I was a 9-year-old boy enjoying what life had to present. But on April the 4th, 1968, I walked into the house. And when I walked into the house, I remember the neighbor screaming. And when she screamed, she says, "They killed him, they killed him, they killed him." And I remember my sister's mother said, "They finally did it. They finally did it." And they were indicating the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Speed forward a couple of days later, or maybe even a week later, not too sure when it was, but I remember the Reverend Charles Churn Jr., the Reverend Williams of Calvary Baptist Church, Reverend Turk, Reverend Gillette, and Reverend Wade. They were prominent ministers of the White Plains, Greenberg area. And I don't want to forget about Reverend Tucker of Christ Temple. They led a march from the county center in White Plains on Tarrytown Road, and the churches all came together, and we marched down Tarrytown Road to the Union Baptist Church. And my vivid memory is marching, and my vivid memory is of this black sheet that was hung on a pole as a flag to represent the mourning that the African American community had undergone. I also remember that when we walked down Tarrytown Road at the time, many of his stores were looted and burned down because of the riots that broke out at the death of Martin Luther King Jr. So let me share with you, and then I'm going to invite my brothers and my sisters to share their aspect of 1968. 1968, if you Google it, it was a primary time in which people, literally people, were taking control over life and taking control over destiny. In 1968, the Dr. Christian Barnard performed the first successful heart transplant. In 1968, and I'm going to be going back over some of these things over and over again, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated. And it's interesting that he moved from being murdered to be assassinated, to give him the prominence of him being not only a civil rights leader, but a human rights leader on a global perspective. In 1968, as a little light period, the first Big Mac goes on sale at McDonald's, and it only costs 49 cents. The Boeing airplane, the 747, takes its first maiden flight. Believe it or not, in 1968, the 911 emergency telephone system is started nationwide. As it is in 1968, so it is now. There was a pandemic that was flooding the entire world, and especially here in America, and it was called the Hong Kong flu. Even after the death of Martin Luther King in 1960, on April 4th in 1968, his lieutenants, including his wife, still engaged in what was called the Poor People's March in Washington, D.C. This was the year in which the television was now coming into its debut. And news that happened within the United States was being able to be televised through people's homes at this particular time. Key technology was occurring, pop culture was birthed, and 1968 will become a pivotal year of new things. Interesting fact that I found out, Brother Jim, and you and Brother Frank may have been a part of this, and Reverend Irvin, was a house cost $14,950 in 1968. The average income was $7,850. Get this, y'all. The monthly rent was $130. A new car, a brand new car, only cost $2,822. And here is the system that really blows my mind. The fact that really blows my mind, that the minimum wage was only $1.60. Founded in that year, Brother Frank, I discovered not only King's assassination, not only, and I'll get into John F. K's assassination, but there was something that occurred in South Carolina for all my South Carolinian members. Something occurred in 1968 in what is called the Orangeburg Massacre, and it occurred on February the 8th, 1968. This is when the civil rights protests occurred on South Carolina State University and turned deadly because highway police officers opened fire on unarmed Black protesters, shooting over 200 of them in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Now, some of my members may have remembered that as children. The movement, there was a movement that was occurring in the 60s. And in that movement, it was going to be a pathway to bring forth a fault line. You know, with an earthquake, where there's a fault line, means an earthquake was about to occur. And in 1968, the fault line from all of the things that were happening in the 60s was about to open up. Well, did open up. The Vietnam was going on. Vietnam War was going on. The Cold War was still happening. Civil rights was coming to the forefront of states and national government. Human rights was emerging, and a youth culture was being established that eventually would take over economics, political, spiritual areas within the United States. They all came together, all these things, Vietnam, the Cold War, the Korean conflict, civil rights, human rights, youth culture, they all came together in 1968 and caused such an electrifying earthquake that it was crazy what was happening. When 1968 ended, the earth shook, and it would go down as the most tumultuous year within the United States history, and that will lead to the 70s. Let me finish. The year of 1968 remains once again, the most tumultuous single year in the history that marks the historic achievements with shocking assassinations. A much hated war was still happening, the Vietnam. And the spirit of challenge, the spirit of challenging the powers that be covered especially the entire United States and the world. And I'll give you some facts about that in a few minutes. All of this was the advent of, to be shown at the dawning of this thing that we now call the television. This year, the year of 1968, TV screens would show our country what we really were all about. In 1968, the TV would show us America, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and scientific marvels that we had never thought that we would ever achieve. Okay? Lyndon Baines Johnson is president. The Vietnam conflict was taking him out. March the 12th, he was inundated with Vietnam. March the 16th, Robert F. Kennedy announces that he's going to run for president in the United States. And on March, I believe it's March the 31st, President Johnson makes a decision that he's not going to run for president of the United States. April the 4th, Martin Luther King once again is assassinated. Let's see, April the 23rd, student protests occur not only in the United States, but throughout the world. New York City, Columbia University, major student demonstration. Poland, major demonstration. West Germany, major demonstration. Mexico City, Paris, Italy, France, and the student demonstration in Paris was so bad that then the president, Charles de Gaulle, dissolved the National Assembly and new elections were created because of the student protests that were happening. Like I said, June, I didn't say this yet, June the 5th, Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated. August 26th through August 29th, the Chicago Democratic Convention occurred. At that Democratic Convention, the Yippies were there. The Student Democratic Society was there. Somebody help me get that right. The Black Panther movement was there. And they was met with police brutality based upon the orders of then the mayor, Richard Daley. You talk about unjust policing, police brutality. That's what happened on the outside. And at the end of that convention, that tumultuous convention, Herbert Humphrey would be the Democratic head of the Democratic Party for the president. Also, that happened that same year, and we don't want to forget this, there was an Olympic protest that occurred. That happened in October the 16th. Tommie Smith and John Carlos did something that would destroy them as athletes here in the United States and not reconcile back with the Olympic medals and honors that they received until this present decade. For those who don't know, those two men, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, doing the singing of the national anthem of the United States of America, the Star-Spangled Banner, bowed their head, lifted up their hand, and held it during the whole time of while the Star-Spangled Banner was going on. It sounds like taking a knee today. Nixon, President Richard Milhous Nixon, becomes the president of the United States of America on November the 5th. And we end the year, Jim, we end the year on a bright light. The Apollo 8 orbits the moon for the first time. Mankind is now circling the moon. And Jim LaVille says these immortal words to close out 1968 on December the 24th, Christmas Eve. The Apollo orbiter goes around the moon, goes around the dark side of the moon. When they come back around on the dark side, Jim LaVille says these words, "Houston, I'm pleased to inform you that there is a Santa Claus." So that was 1968, assassinations, protests, national assemblies. President Lyndon Baines Johnson makes a decision not to run. Bobby Kennedy is killed. Dr. King is killed. Our African-American communities, from Watts to Chicago to Detroit to New York City to Atlanta, Georgia, are all set aflames when Dr. King is killed. Student protests, police brutality like we never ever saw it before are all happening in 1968. And as we reflect on 1968, we see there was a mentality of brutality and violence, which was stirred up, but a change had to happen. And an earthquake happened. And I believe, just as sure as we saw the sad events on Wednesday, that maybe 2020 is an earth-shaking event, that things have culminated and come together so that America once again can look at itself and say, what's happening? Brother Jim, it's in your hands.
Thank you so much, Reverend Charles. You're fantastic. Really, really good. Really good. I think we all appreciate it. Well, Frank, maybe we can, I want to be conscious of time, but I think we have time. We want to make sure maybe we can begin and go, as they say, in the spirit, not that I'm a Mets fan, but go around the horn and give people a chance. Any questions for Reverend Trollinger, or comments on 68 for themselves, or that we might want to share with each other at the moment? Is anyone who would like to begin? Jim Parker, please.
Hi, everyone. I'll just share briefly with you my remembrances of 68. I was an Army brat. My father was at West Point, but I was going to school in Boston, a hotbed of the Students for a Democratic Society, which is the name you were looking for. So I had this back and forth between the protest and the anti-war movement in Boston and so forth, and going back to West Point, where they were burying first lieutenants that had graduated the year before in the cemetery, having been killed in Vietnam. That summer, I was an intern for AT&T. They sent me to Chicago to secure the manhole covers. There was a whole bunch of us sent there to secure all the manhole covers in the city of Chicago because they were worried about people blowing up the telecommunications, among other things. And I had the experience of seeing the police riot out my hotel window and learning what tear gas felt like, because it was all over that part of the city. I went back to school at Ball, and then Robert Kennedy is assassinated. And what went through my mind was, has the world lost its mind? John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. I said, where's it going to stop? That really, for me, was quite the year. So I'll turn it over to someone else.
Okay. Wayne?
I'd like to make a comment or two. Excuse me. Just to highlight some of Reverend Charles's comments, all of which I appreciated very much. It always disturbed me because I was a lot older than 9 at the time. Matter of fact, I was 31 and a single dad at the time. I remember the South Carolina State, what I would call massacre, very well. It always disturbed me that the nation always remembered and reflected on Kent State, but never, hardly ever commented on what happened in Orangeburg, South Carolina, which was much more drastic than Kent State. The other thing I'd like to just highlight, when Tommy Smith and Juan Carlos raised their hand, that was the beginning of the Black Power salute. They had black gloves on their hands. And it truly changed their life drastically, but at the same time, they really started a unique movement that today is more than, to me, symbolic. And then the other thing, on a lighter note, in 1968, the Jets won the American Football League championship, and they went on in January of '69 to beat the Baltimore Colts when Joe Namath gave his famous guarantee. So those are the only comments I'd like to add.
Very good, Wayne. Thank you. Dennis, did you have something? You're on mute.
Yeah, did you?
Oh,
Yeah,
Jonathan, please.
1960 also.
You're up next, Dan. Go ahead, Jonathan.
1968 also, we saw, well, for me, I was young, I was 20. We saw the begin, I'm sorry, I was 30. We saw, what was new to me was the beginning of this movement, counter movement. There was a tremendous reaction to all the things that Reverend Tollinger talked about, particularly the Vietnam War protests, the riots in Chicago. There was this huge right-wing reaction, which most obviously led to Nixon's election in November of '68. And it really is a straight line to the events of last Wednesday, where the right wing so bitterly resents the demonstrators who were not out fighting in Vietnam, were protesting instead. And they didn't think they had, these are the white, the people who were particularly resented in this instance were the white protesters. They didn't have, they didn't think they had really a legitimate grievance. They didn't think they had, they thought they were spoiled brats. And actually, but that year in the numbers, the counter protesters won. They won the presidency, and they won. There was really the right wing. A lot of right wing forces got momentum. So it's like for every action, there's a strong reaction, and we see it bouncing down through the decades through today. Worse today, maybe.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Dennis? You're on mute.
Okay,
Okay,
all right. So I was 20 years old that year in college at Iona. And the thing that really stands out in my mind, there's so many things there as Reverend Trollinger went through it. Sometimes because of the time, it's so long ago that you don't remember that was all happening at once. But for me, when I was told by my father and I were working in Brooklyn, it was summer for me, and it was just a summer job, and we would drive to Brooklyn every day, and he would wake me up, at 7:30 in the morning. I'm a 20-year-old, college kid, and it's summer, and whatever pub I was in the night before, he would make sure I got up, and we drove down to Brooklyn together. But this one morning he came in, and it was Bobby Kennedy's assassination, who at the time, I remember, for me, he was a guy who seemed to be getting it about what was going on. And I was so looking forward to him carrying on. And then when it was just snuffed out like that, it was like a punch in the gut. At some point, the other thing that I would mention, although it's not right in the 1968 and 1970, was the Kent State shootings. Was I had not done much protesting myself up until that time, but I drove onto that Iona campus, got the first sign I could, and joined the other students there. And that's just a memory I'll never forget. Thanks,
thanks,
Jeff.
Dan. David?
Yeah, in '68, sorry about Iona there, Dennis. I was a sophomore at Fordham. And actually 68 and junior in the fall.
Yeah.
To me, it was just like 18 or so. I was a holy shit year. What else is going to happen? I lived in the South Bronx at the time, and RFK was campaigning on 170th Street between the Concourse and Jerome Avenue, which is near where I live. There were thousands of people, all right? And it was a very integrated neighborhood, Black, Hispanic at the time, white. I mean, there were just throngs of people there celebrating the fact that we thought this guy was going to be our savior. We had already witnessed what had gone on with the Reverend King, and we felt, who else is left to try to save this country? And so the enthusiasm for RFK was so vibrant and alive. To see him shot down like that, I think it was maybe 2 weeks after he had appeared in front of us, was just shocking. But I also want to add that history doesn't count things chronologically. History, we as humans like to put things in boxes, and years with numbers are a great box. But history doesn't work that way. 68 lasted for 3 years. It lasted through 1969, and it lasted through 1970.
Right.
Marches on Washington. I was in those marches on Washington. I watched the FBI guys with telephoto lenses take pictures of us from the rooftops. We watched as we were guarded by soldiers and with AR, whatever the number of the particular rifle was at the time. The first lottery for the draft was then. And of course, in 1970, 1969, we also had some interestingly good things. We had the first guy walk on the moon. We had Woodstock. So maybe there was going to be a rebound, but then 1970, we had Jackson State, which people tend to forget about, as well as Kent State. So to me, 68 was longer than just one chronological year. And it was a time period that as Jonathan was talking about, really did show a huge division in this country. There was another thing that happened roughly at that same time, which very few people may remember. It was called the Hard Hat Riot in New York City, where construction workers who look very much like the guys who just assaulted the Congress invaded and tried to break in to City Hall in New York City because they resented what was going on, and they resented the elite college kids who were protesting the war and protesting in front of the Federal Reserve building down by Wall Street. So I think in terms of dealing with this year, we kind of have to keep a look at what's going to come up in the future, because 2020 just doesn't end on December 31st, as 1968 did not end on December 31st.
Great, thanks, David. Frank, you want to add anything, or?
Yeah,
Mr.
I think
Boone?
for me, I think David's point is well taken up. Growing up in the South in Mississippi, and of course, as we speak about Jim Crow and Dr. King had been in my hometown many a times, marching, protesting. My hometown, Canton, Mississippi, is known as the cradle of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. My mom was the first Black woman elected to the town board in my hometown. And Dr. Fonzie Wright Brown, who's speaking with our kids on Tuesday night, she was the first Black woman elected to office in Mississippi. And she worked with Dr. King and John Lewis. John Lewis used to come to my parents' house, and he loved fried chicken and collard greens. And my mom worked with him and Fannie Lou Hamer and all of that. But I remember that evening when Dr. King was assassinated. It was overcast, kind of cloudy, and I just felt like there was something different about that day. That it was almost like there was darkness that overcame the evening that Dr. King was assassinated. But then the next morning, I know that there was riots and all over the country, from Newark to Detroit to Boston, everywhere. But even in Mississippi, our hometown, the next day, we all took off to go to City Hall in Canton. And if you know anything about Jim Crow and the white sheriff, the white police, you know that they could be brutal. So about 2,000 young people left school to march on City Hall. And being young and naive and everything that was going, we had to let that out. We vented because Dr. King had been to our hometown and had been active in trying to bring about voter registration, voter education. My first job was voter education and voter registration in 1967. Just going to people's homes, trying to get them to register to vote. Many resisted because that could be harmful to them. But because of Dr. Fonzie Wright, she's speaking for us on Tuesday night, and others, they interceded. I would imagine that a lot of people would have been hurt or killed if they had not. There was just so much pain and so much hurt as it relates to the death of Dr. King. And then the summer of 1968, I was in Chicago. And so Chicago was kind of like a very difficult place for voter rights. And you remember Dr. King's march, his protest in Cicero. There was basically segregation in housing. Poor people had a hard way to go. Black people had a hard way to go. And of course, we all know Mayor Richard Daley and the demonstrations in Chicago. So my memories of 1968 with Dr. King's assassination, and then with the Black Power movement, I had an experience with H. Rap Brown when he would come down and they would take us through H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, and they empowered and inspired us to let us know that that we were not inferior, because we grew up thinking that Black were second-class citizens. So they came down south trying to empower high school students and college students to register to vote, to protest, to demonstrate. I've done a lot of that stuff. And And I think David's point was 1968 did not end in December. It went on. I remember Jackson State. I remember Kent. I remember all of those particular shootings, and it takes me back to Goodman, Cheney, and Foreigner, who were murdered in Mississippi. So all of these events had a profound effect on our country. And now here we are today with what had happened in Washington, D.C. the other day. And I think that I see some parallels in that regard. I see the parallels in terms of people are still fighting for social justice. People are still trying to fight to make sure that this country live out its mission, that all people are equal and we're just human beings trying to find a better way. And I think that that is going to go on for a while as we try to pick up the pieces over the last 4 years, because still we live in a very divided nation. So I just wanted to put that out.
Thanks, Frank. Who'd like to go up next? Paul? Mark, you're next up.
Thanks. Nothing momentous. I also I'm a little older. I was living in White Plains. I was paying $115 a month for my bachelor apartment. I was teaching school in Tarrytown. I had given my resignation of a tenured position and on to a different school district, because it seemed you could do that sort of thing then. I remember where I was for both of those assassinations. I remember walking out of the theater on April 4th into Times Square and seeing everybody looking up at the news scroll and seeing about that assassination, and the RFK assassination. Staying up late, hearing his victory speech in California, his last words, on to Chicago and let's win there. And I turned off the television and went to bed because I had to teach school the next day, and woke up with that. And the Chicago convention, the riots, I remember all of that, and can't help but think back to August of 1974 when he left office, and thinking, thank God we'll never have a president as bad as that again. Sorry.
Thanks, Paul. Mark, sadly.
Yeah, it's fascinating listening. I mean, we all come from such different backgrounds and experiences, although there's obviously similar things that have gone on. Jim, one thing I was thinking quickly listening, if we ever get to that point of the memoirs,
Yes.
boy, there's a lot that I think we can all probably put down on paper regarding this. I mean, I have numerous recollections. I was a senior in college, supposedly going to graduate in June of '68, and because of the war, not the assassinations, I was looking to go to law school, which would not have been a deferment at that time. So I extended my graduation to avoid that, and wound up graduating in January of '69, the impact. But what stands out most, and always has for me, is, I grew up a middle-class Jewish kid from Queens, going not to Boston, but in the Boston area. I was at Clark University and a senior at that time, and pretty liberal-minded thinking, and had friends, but no deep relationships with anyone that really came from a disadvantaged background. And my fraternity experiences, predominantly a Jewish fraternity, Phi Sigma Delta in those days. And we had our not non-white, non-Jewish members too. And I remember sitting in the student union, I don't know if it was the 4th or the 5th, with several of the guys from the union. And one of my good friends was a black kid out of the city, but he was as much middle class as I was, other than the color of his skin. And I remember all of us, it was sort of an awakening to him as well as to us, as what is this all about? How should I be addressing this? How should I be dealing with it? Mike was very much taken aback after King's assassination. Mike Foltz, I remember to this day his name. and sort of in some respects, an awakening as to his being Black and what that meant, and several of others being white and what that meant and how we should respond. And we had interesting conversations thereafter. But that day, from that perspective, sort of awakened me to, I grew up very advantaged and in a very different environment. And while I was aware of other things going on, this made it a little bit more personal. Ultimately, I don't know how it affected me thereafter. That's for others probably to say. But the different backgrounds we all grew up in, and the events of that year clearly affected so many of us in so many different ways.
Thank you, Mark. Anyone else? Time for a few more. Anyone who I'm missing you?
I'll say a few words. Thank you, Jim. White Plains was and always has been a very unique place to live and grow up. I was a junior in high school, and it was a melting pot as it is today. And I think it's a great, great tribute to all of the people that live and work in White Plains, and the clergy, and just all the citizens, how they get together. Going to school in White Plains, I had many African-American friends. Bob Tuck, who you just honored with the Youth Bureau, was one of my close friends. We were on the gymnastics team together. And when this happened, we were more together than against each other. And it was really a very unique perspective. As horrendous as it was, we had on both sides of the town solidarity and togetherness. The only thing I remember somewhat vividly was we had 2 giant cherry trees in the front courtyard of the school. And there were some kids who were protesting, and they had a cherry fight from those trees. They were picking the cherries off and throwing them at each other. That was the worst thing that had happened. And Manson Donahue, the principal, ordered that the trees be cut down so there would be no more issues. But it was horrendous, but we had a more, I think, accepting and caring feeling. Laura Evans Havis was a close friend. Both of them still are. And we came together rather than being apart. And it made it, I think, better for both and all in the area, and kept it from being a horrendous, riotous situation in downtown White Plains. I remember my father, though, telling me he did some real estate work for Reverend Gillette, and they were close friends. He helped him get that whole assemblage on Lake Street where they now have the AME Zion and church. And he worked with him, and he marched down Tarrytown Road. That was the one thing I remember in that march that Reverend Trollinger referred to. But I also agree with what David Green said about how it melded into other years. I remember applying to Kent State for college, and I thank God every day that I didn't end up going there, because I could have been one of those people who ended up shot. I ended up going to school in New Jersey. So that worked out. And the whole lottery system, again, I thank God every day that I got one of the highest lottery numbers available on as my birth date. And I didn't have to go and serve in Vietnam, because many of my friends obviously went to Vietnam and were killed, came back totally different than they were. And so that whole 68, 69, 70 melded together, as David said, and it was very formative in my life, but I was blessed greatly by the events that took place afterwards. So that's a different perspective than some. Thank you.
All right, I'll say I'll take a moment. We talked about Chicago. In 1968, I was at Berkeley. I had been involved in a lot of student protests. I was actually the youth director in the city. And I was studying criminology. I was very interested in how to change the criminal justice system. Berkeley had a school that Reagan closed in 1975 for being too radical. But in 1968, I was very involved looking at issues of how to reform the criminal justice system. And when there were demonstrations on campus, the Berkeley police and the Oakland police really went after the students. And I found it infuriating. And one of the things I did is I made an appointment to meet with the police chief of UC Berkeley, a guy named Bill Beal, and he was furious that a student should ask to interview him about how he handled the protests. And ultimately, some of the faculty talked to him, and I interviewed him, and it was clear to me that he really had no sense of what rights students had on campus. And it turned out one of the professors I had was been undersheriff of San Mateo County, which, if you've ever flown into San Francisco, is the county right below San Francisco, a man named Gordon Meisner. And he and the sheriff of San Mateo County in 1964, when the Republicans had their convention with Barry Goldwater, were the first law enforcement officers to agree that people had a right to protest at a convention. And they made sure that SNCC and CORE and other organizations of the time had a right to protest. And he began to get involved with the idea of how do police handle political conventions. And I was one of his students, and we talked, and he said he was going to Chicago for the 1968 Democratic Convention. And did I want to go with him and see how the police were going to handle this convention? So he and I went. I met him there. My older brother had, as I mentioned, been one of Bobby Kennedy aides. So he was there in a hotel room. And by day, Gordon Meisner and I met with different police and talked to them about what they were going to do at the convention. And at night, we were in Grant Park running around being chased by the police and seeing how totally out of control they were and how out of control Mayor Daley was. And I was sleeping on the floor of my brother's hotel room. I was saying, hey man, this is a fucking disaster out here. And finally, people realized what was happening. And for me, professionally, I've been involved since then, trying to deal with issues of police reform in our society. You may well remember in 1968, Johnson created the Kerner Commission, which was the first commission that looked at policing and found that there were very few police who had college degrees or had any sense of what community policing may have been. And it really has led me to be involved, and Frank knows, and we've done Youth Police Initiative and how to build trust in communities. And I guess finally, on the upbeat side, when I returned from Chicago, I went on campus to go back to school and go to work in Berkeley in the September of 1968. And I met a young woman on campus, went out with a date with her, and we went on another date, and we've lived together ever since and have been married over 50, whatever the hell years. So let me see, before we begin to wind up and I turn it back over to Reverend Tollinger, anyone else?
Yes,
Please,
yes,
please.
right. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I'm a product of Vidalia, Georgia, and of course, I was born during the Jim Crow time, where life was not the best in the South. But as a child, things are the way they are, so you live those things. But I was blessed to come to White Plains, New York, and when I was 10 years old, and it was quite an awakening experience for me to be in integrated schools, and things were so much different. So I really have enjoyed the White Plains experience. That was a very trying time for a lot of people, not fully understanding that the gravity of that situation and all the things that was caused or created by rioting and what have you. Of course, the assassination of King was just impacted the Black community terribly, and it was just a trying time for me. I was a single parent, just my son and I. So I was of course, I was impacted just trying to survive, have an apartment and what have you, and trying to make things the best for my son. He didn't have the experiences I had, but but when I look back and I have been blessed to have been attended the King Museum twice, about a 6-year difference in both visits. But it was an awakening call of that era for me. And I try to instill in young people today, the importance of integration and the importance of respecting each other, no matter what your race, creed, or religion may be. It's so very important because we're only here a short time and you only have an opportunity. There's a platform, and that platform is opportunities to share, especially share God's word, which I think we all embraces, that we need each other, and to love one another, and to understand that God is God and all things happen for a purpose, and there will be some changes made. And today with what happened here just recently, it's really mind-boggling. Here in 2021, such things are still going on. Such a feeling in people that can easily embrace eyes and continue to embrace it and to follow up with this with riotous situation. But anyway, that was a great time for me in 1968, to the point that I was a young father when I was listening to Reverend Trollinger. He was speaking about some of those pastors had a great influence in those days. When Reverend Chern and Reverend Wade, who was my pastor, and Reverend Turk, and Reverend Gillette, they were very instrumental in guiding the communities, calming the communities, and to standing up and being leaders of the community. But White Plains, I just have to sound out White Plains. White Plains has been a great city for me, a great town. The White Plains High School, the entire experience was great for me, and even to this day, there are need for improvements, but it's a great city. And I think we live in a great country too. And there is, of course, we have to set an example, not only for our community, but for the entire world. And these things are extremely important. And I think that we as individuals owe that not just to ourselves and to our families, but to the global community. Thank you.
Thank you, DeWitt. Reverend Trollinger, can I turn it back over to you?
Well, Jim, before we go back to Reverend,
Yeah,
I'd like to
please.
hear, I see Reverend Graves is.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Reverend Graves.
I'd like to hear from Reverend
Thank
Graves.
you.
And I have a friend on Tabidi Boone. If Reverend Graves or Tabidi could add anything.
Both of them. Go ahead,
I was
please.
going to ask for a moment. I'd like to first thank Reverend Trollinger for his comments today. It brought up a lot of history, a lot of painful history. We are still going through a very horrific and devastating time. And listening to David Green, he is absolutely on point that this is not something that has a starting and ending point. We are going to continue to go through this. And because we finished 2020, that 21 is going to be a better year. This whole race thing is the greatest nemesis to this country. And I'm a city boy. I mean, I was 35 in 1968. And I remember my early years going south because my family, grandparents basically were from the South. And being a city boy, for the summers, I would usually get sent south so that the family could have some time to themselves, but I could visit other family. And such a contrast, such a contrast. And I didn't understand it at first, but my aunt, who I stayed with in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, I remember it very distinctly. She cautioned me about so many different things while I was down there. So I learned the difference between living in the North and living in the South, and what you can do, what you could do and what you couldn't do. It is, you know, I went to historically Black college as well. I did my picketing in the 50s. We had a movie house just outside Morgan State's campus, and we picketed, and we had a few dogs out there and some state troopers. Nobody got hurt, but the idea was that you couldn't sit in the, you could go to that movie house, but you had to sit upstairs. And in fact, they even had the upstairs balcony separated for white and Black. And if there weren't any seats for Black folks up there, you had to wait for the next show. So it didn't make any difference whether they had plenty of empty seats in the balcony on the white side or downstairs. But this is an ongoing problem that this country is going to continue to deal with. And there are obviously no easy answers to it, but it does, and it will require just constant conversation between people like us and those folks not like us, to understand what the issues are and how best to try to solve those issues. And it's really only about respecting the other person, understanding what their history and trials have been, and to just openly discuss, you know, what the pain is and why, and to be able to go forward. So I think we just have to try to lean into it. 2021 is going to be an interesting year. We're going to have some ups and downs, some bumps, and we're going to have to roll with the punches. So I just like to say that I appreciate what the grandpas are doing, because I think they are lending themselves to the building of the youth in this community by giving answers and providing guidance and direction. So I think we have to continue to do what we're doing, because it has to do with the young people in this community. And if we don't put them on the right track, you know, our future is bleak.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. David?
Jim, I was going to ask a friend of
Yeah.
mine.
Yeah,
to-
please.
Oh,
Yeah.
Nick? Oh, okay, we have Dean.
Go
Yeah,
ahead, Dean, and then Frank will go back to you. Go ahead, Dean.
Okay, yeah, I just like to say, just listening, and it's some very compelling stories. And one gentleman had said that you know, one thing is interesting about it is that we all come from different backgrounds. And so when I heard that we were going to discuss 1968, it sent chills up and down my spine, because there were so many things that were going on. I was 15 years old at the time, growing up in a housing project in the Bronx. And I can remember it was some tumultuous times. What was going on in my particular environment was drug addiction. There were so many young men and young women that were being either incarcerated or addicted to drugs. I think that's something that possibly I didn't hear. That was what was going on in the urban communities. Unfortunately, it had continued after 68, as we all know. Also, what I can remember too was the militancy during that era. The Black Muslims were very prominent in the urban areas. They were very influential. With the assassination of Malcolm X, caused a lot of young men my age to be gravitated towards the Black Panthers, the BLA, the Young Lords during that time. You mentioned Johnny Carlos. Johnny Carlos actually came from my neighborhood. And I remember he was, after he came back from the Olympics, he was hailed as a hero, as he should have been. Luckily, I survived that era. My parents wind up, I would say, transporting me to the Virgin Islands, which enabled me to escape some of the negativity that was going on in my environment. But someone had said that possibly you were thinking about writing memoirs. And I think that would be an excellent thing, and if we could compile it and put it together, because again, we all come from different backgrounds and have different perspectives of during that time. I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to take up too much of anybody's time. I just like to say that that was also a viewpoint that was going on from those who actually lived in the urban environments.
Thanks, Dean. And we will get to the memoir writing. I'm glad to hear people's interest. I know we had some discussion last time, but we'll get to it in the next round. So Frank, you want to introduce your colleague?
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge a friend of mine, Brother Tabidi Boone. Brother Boone, are you there? Just any, just a few comments, and then we'll go right back to Reverend Trollinger.
Okay. You all right? You're on mute. You're on mute. You're on. You okay? He's okay.
He's okay. All right, then, Jim, we'll go back to Reverend Trollinger for any closing thoughts and comments.
Okay, Reverend Trollinger, and thank you, everyone. Did you want to say something, Beth? Please.
Just hold your space bar down. If you hold your space bar down, it should unmute. Press and hold your space bar. No.
All right. There'll be a next time. Thank you. Reverend Trollinger.
Okay, I'm going to close out with something that that I read, and I'm going to personalize it. First of all, thank you all for the comments that you shared about 1968. Some of them brought tears to my eyes because, once again, White Plains, Greenberg, and Mamaroneck hid a lot of the racism, prejudice, and segregation that was happening for young people, especially my age. So it wasn't until later in life that I began to experience and understand what the racial divide was all about. But let me close with these words. In those riotous days of 1968, it sometimes felt that America was coming apart. And America did not come apart, but many Americans had forgotten the life lessons of 1968 that took place. Certainly, they were hard lessons on both sides of the divide. As a result, America, once again, because we have not learned from 1968, 69, and 70, we are still paying a heavy, heavy toll because we failed to learn again the lessons that have been taught to us. 1968, some people believe that America was overdue for a transformation. Robert Kennedy was going to be the Democratic nominee for the president of the United States. Great hope and belief was placed in this man. He opposed the Vietnam War. He was an advocate for racial justice. And it seemed like America was going to get some hope. but he was assassinated. Racial strife continued to divide our country, and the passion, hot passion, ran thoroughly through both sides of the divide. President Johnson decided not to run. Herbert Humphrey won the Democratic convention. But what America fails to remember, that when Herbert Humphrey moved out of Chicago to run, the Democratic Party itself was divided. So no constructive solutions were created. And so once again, here we are in the United States of America. And we have a hard division happening within our nation. We, as the people, have some legitimate concerns on both sides of the divide. But violence and overreaction and our failure to come to a just compromise will cause us to relive times over and over again. And I pray, literally pray, that you and I will have learned the lessons of history and speak to the powers that be and become the powers that be, so that our children will not have to live once again with overreaching violence and overreactionary situations such as Wednesday. That we are America, and we are going to make it where all men, all women are created equal in the sight of God. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Reverend Trollinger. Frank, anything you'd like to?
I just want to thank everyone for participating. And this coming Tuesday evening, a friend of mine, Dr. Phronsie Wright Brown, she's speaking with our kids, our Keepers of the Dream, close to 50 kids, about her experience with Dr. King and post-Reconstruction, and stories about Stokely Carmichael, James Meredith, and all of that. I'll send the link out. We'll post it. If you're welcome to join us as we continue to look back, and then we'll look forward in terms of how grandpas can help our young people live in a just community, a just world.
Okay, I want to thank everyone. We'll be meeting again later this month. Thank you for your very poignant, insightful comments. We appreciate everyone. There's much more for us to do as grandpas. There was some comment about how we might have these kinds of discussions and include young people with us. So there's lots more to come. I want to thank everyone who is doing the mentoring with the youth court. The feedback has been outstanding for everyone's involvement. There's real interest there. And in the spirit of, I really appreciate Reverend Trollinger here. I want to wish everyone a happy, healthy, safe New Year as we move forward together as Grandpas United. So thank you.
Here.
David, you want to hang on? And Frank and Ellen and I will meet.
Jim, no, I have to run to another meeting, so you all carry on, and I'll catch up with you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jim.
Reverend Trollinger.
Thanks,
Thank
Reverend
you.
Trollinger.
Thank you.
God bless all of you.
Great day.
Great meeting,
Thank
guys.
you,
Take care.
Reverend Trollinger.
Thank you.
Grandpas.
Thank you, Reverend Thripp, really.
Thank you.
Whatever.
Jim, it's Dennis.